I have. Mark has been leading us through, for the last 3 weeks now. Like we had Partners Relief come in for 1 week, but for the other weeks, we've been looking at how to build spiritual resilience. One of my favourite topics is resilience or endurance, so I have been looking forward to this. I know that in the message that Mark preached that unfortunately we didn't get onto podcast, he was preaching from what is sometimes called the roll call of faith in Hebrews 11. And that finishes, and the writer just goes, you know what? He just runs out of space on the page, basically. I don't have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, David, Jephthah, Samuel, and all the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. And then it lists all of the troubles and trials and endurance that they had to build in order to get the job done. I am so kicking myself I missed out on that sermon. But that's okay. And then last week we again heard how to build spiritual endurance. And I was trying to think, how can I build on this? How can I, take it up another notch? So I thought I'd just go for a really practical example. So if you can sit in for the next 3 hours. No, I'm not going to do that. What I am going to do, though, is come at this from a slightly different angle. And instead of looking at how do we build spiritual endurance, I'm going to spin it around and I'm going to say, well, why should we bother? Why bother building spiritual endurance? Really? Anybody who's in business or education or sport, I could keep going on, but basically anybody that partakes in meaningful labour, not just paid work, but anybody that wants to contribute anything, knows that to build any sort of endurance is hard work. And today we're offered so many alternatives. We could so easily just become a place where we come here on Sunday morning, listen to a really easy message, have some coffee, have some fellowship, go home and be completely unchanged. We could so easily drift into that if we wanted to, couldn't we? But why do we instead, week after week, come here and learn how to build resilience? Doesn't God do all of our fighting for us anyway? Or to put it another way, what is the upside to us building spiritual resilience? What, if anything, do we get out of it? And that's the question that I want to ask today. I'm going to start off lectionary today. We'll get back to where the lectionary takes us. But I believe what the key verses that speak to us about endurance and tests and trials is James 1, starting from verse 2. This is perhaps, the verse that speaks to us the most about trials and endurance and what we get out of it. So I'll just read this starting from verse 2. And I've got a slightly different translation here on my notes, but that's all right. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Let endurance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. And when I read through this, several words sort of jump out at me. It starts in a really weird spot, something about joy. And then there's trials and testing, which you wouldn't really normally put together. And then it goes on to resilience or endurance or perseverance are all ways that our modern translations translate the same word. And then there's this reference to lacking and requesting wisdom, which seems to be like a little weird tacked on to the end there. And what I want to do is jump around in here, and I'm going to start in the middle, and we'll start with this idea of endurance, and we'll work backwards to how do we get to joy. And we'll look at some of the other passages throughout Scripture as we go along. But I'm going to start with there. Let perseverance or endurance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. Now, no matter what area in life we find ourselves, how many of you are either drawn to somebody who has endurance or are daunted by them if you have to oppose them? We've just finished watching the Olympic Games. What a great celebration of everything God has created us to be. People that have worked with the pinnacle of what God gave them and then went and did something extraordinary. But that would be after years of enduring and training day after day after day. But in every other area we face, it's the same thing. Even when we watch movies, the hero is always the one that outlasts the bad guys. In a romantic comedy, it's the one that outlasts the trials that get thrown in their ways. Even in history, history is written by those that have endured and have actually come out on top. In every area, endurance tends to matter the most. I had a really great first-hand experience of this. I grew up, with my twin brother Troy. And we used to fight as all brothers did. And Troy, if you've met him before, he's the same height as Mum. You would not tend to think of him as the best fighter or the best in a fight. But he could endure. Now, he recreationally runs Ironman triathlons. Let's go for a ride from here to Toowoomba and back. After swimming from here to Margate. And then to finish the day, we'll run a marathon. And he does this recreationally. He can endure. But growing up with him, I was the academic one, he was the sporty one. I used to get picked on by bullies. Used to being the operative word, because at some point they found out who my brother was. And they knew that if they got into a fight with him, he would endure. And they'd knock him down and he'd get back up. And they'd knock him down and he'd get back up again. And again. And again. And they very quickly realised, it's not worth fighting. We are not going to fight Troy because he will endure. And I got a very first-hand lesson in the importance of enduring from my little twin brother. But this was drilled into me from an early age. My memories from growing up on a farm. Riding a bike, you fall off. Here's a Band-Aid. Get back on the bike. You get thrown off a horse into a fence. Here's a bandage. Get back on the horse. You ride a bike down a flight of stairs and get impaled on a palm tree. We'll take you to the doctors and give you a rousing for riding a bike down a flight of stairs. But when we get back home, you are getting back on that bike. Mum remembers all of these incidents, don't she? But it was drilled into all of us Austin boys that anything that you want to achieve in life will require endurance, will require you to stick at it. And James here says you don't develop just by developing a little bit of endurance. James reminds us that we need to let endurance complete its work. You can't just stick at something for an hour or a minute or until the next ad break. Try teaching your kids homework. You have to endure through more than one ad break. No, you need to endure until the job is complete, until what has been put before you comes to fruition. And that is how you build endurance. And that may be a very long time. I've just picked two examples, not from my own life, but from history, and then we'll have a look at one from Jesus' history as well, where endurance shifted history, or has the potential to shift history. The first one was back from World War II. I love military history. I think I inherited that from Dad. I love looking at military history, but one of the things I love is the speeches and the political leaders that actually would rally their troops. And in the darkest hours of World War II, when Britain was being bombed day in, day out, and Churchill was trying to rally his troops and get all of Britain to endure, he stood up before their parliament, and this is what he said. He said, "You will never see a white flag fly over Britain." And then this next part of his speech was broadcast to all of Britain, but also across the channel into Germany itself. He said, "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and on the oceans. Shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. And we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. And we shall fight in the hills. And we will never, ever surrender." This was a rallying cry to every single person who heard it, not just to resist a little, But he was setting them up because he knew this would be a long slog. They would have to endure until the end of this war to see evil vanquished. But it had a secondary effect as well. This was broadcast intentionally across the channel. And those words would be Hitler's worst nightmare. Up until this point, he had rolled through and countries had either fallen before him or surrendered to him, or his army had taken them in a day or two in the Blitzkrieg. But Churchill said, no, you will have to fight for every inch. We will fight you where you are in France. If you drive us off there, we will fight you in the oceans. If you drive us off there, we will fight you in the beaches. You are going to have to fight us every single inch because we are going to out-endure you. They would be Hitler's worst nightmare, hearing those words. He knew if he wanted to conquer Europe, he would have to invade and kill every last Briton. You see, when you have endurance, when you have that enduring spirit in your own life, it can project this, just as the bullies were afraid to pick on me because they knew they would have to out-endure Troy. Sometimes just having endurance is enough to turn your enemies away, is enough to actually allow you to go forward because people know it's not worth opposing them. It's not worth opposing you. I'm going to have to reevaluate if I really want to take on somebody who has that much endurance. So let's take it from that big picture of, world history and warfare down to something that's the most intimate. Let's look at marriages. Lots of words, countless books and programs have been written for successful marriages. I use some of those resources. They're great resources. But what are the key words really that every marriage needs to hear? I'm not going anywhere. You don't really want to use the word endure because it doesn't really sound too romantic. I'm going to endure with you. You don't want to use that word. But we all have fights in marriages, don't we? We all have struggles, we all have pain. But the one thing that you want to know, no matter what pain we go through, no matter what trials we face between each other, or trials that we face against us as a couple, I will endure. I will be with you today, and I will be with you tomorrow, and I will be with you the next day, and the next, and the next. You imagine just how much society would change if everybody that walked down that aisle and said, I will be with you for better or worse, had the endurance to actually mean it and stick at it. How much of a society would change just if we heard those words in every marriage? You see then the importance of endurance. Endurance isn't just this, sort of one character trait that we have to develop amongst everything else. Endurance is the character trait in which all other character traits find their ultimate expression. It's easy to say I love you for a day or an hour or whatever. I'm going to love you for the next 70 years. 62. What an awesome example. And that is the power of endurance. Let's just prove the whole point of my sermon. I think we just wrap that up now. Okay. So endurance is the crown gem, not just in a marriage, but in all areas of our life. Unless you think that Brad's just passionate about endurance because he had it drilled into him when he was young. Let's look at this lectionary from last week. Hebrews 12, starting from verse 1. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. The writer of Hebrews here, he's encouraging everybody to, not quit. And he cites Jesus as an example, and he doesn't champion Jesus' deity or his empathy or his wisdom or his grace or his love. What does he champion about Jesus? His endurance. You know, when I was studying New Testament in history, one of the questions that we struggled with in class was, why did Jesus have to endure what he did? Why did he have to endure the whippings and the beatings and the cross? Couldn't he have just been found guilty by the Sanhedrin and then God gives him a heart attack and he escapes all of that? That was a question we wrestled with. Why couldn't he just suspend his nerve endings so he didn't feel anything? He had the power to do that. Well, here the writer of Hebrews gives us that example, or gives us at least part of the answer. Jesus endured as with all things to set an example for us, so that we would endure. Jesus doesn't ask us to do things that he hasn't gone through himself. And just as he modelled for us in every other aspect of his life, he models for us in this one too. So you can see then the power of endurance. If you can get it in your own life, or in a marriage, or in a church, or in a society, or in a whole nation, it can change everything. So having established that there's power in endurance, James, the little brother of Jesus, he steps it up a notch and says, well, when you have spiritual endurance, well, then you really have something. He actually says you lack nothing. When you can demonstrate a rugged faith and enduring spirit in your relationship with God and what he calls you to do, you know, if you can reach a point in your life when you can honestly say, there is nothing this life can throw at me that will cause me to defect from God and his path, then James says, you're ready, you're complete, you lack nothing. When God has proven himself to you enough times, then you're complete. You know, it's interesting, they've done studies as to, when do people think they have enough? Or when do people think they are complete? And they asked everybody, from people that had very few resources, people in, the middle, right up to the 1%. And they said, how much more of anything do you think you would need to be complete? You know what everybody said, on average? About 20% more. Yeah. The person who's earning $1,000 a year, I could be happy with about 20% more. The person who's earning $10,000 a year, I could be happy with about 20% more. The person who is earning $1 billion a year, I could be happy with about 20% more. Okay. When we try and focus on what we can get, it's never going to be enough. Never. And that wasn't a Christian study. That was just I think that was from one of the Pew Research in the States. I just want 20% more. But here James says, no, you want to be complete? You want to lack nothing? Spiritual endurance. When you can trust God with absolutely everything, when you know he can be trusted, when you know you can follow him, I won't say through hell and back, but you get the picture. Man, then you're ready. And then just as an aside here, since it was sort of hanging on the end, I think that also includes wisdom and our own growth and our own application of God's knowledge for us. I find it really interesting because James says, if you have this spiritual endurance, you'll lack nothing. Oh, but if you lack wisdom, you should ask God for it. Doesn't that seem like we can read through that so easily, but doesn't that seem a little bit strange? You lack nothing. If you lack wisdom, ask God for it. Well, I was looking at that, and my Greek isn't the best, but I actually looked at what he'd written in there. And I think it's possible that James may have intentionally been a little vague here. The testing of what he actually wrote in the Greek, when we translate from Greek to English, they sometimes move the words around so we can actually read it, because the language structure is a bit different. But what he actually wrote was, the testing of your faith produces endurance. You will be complete. If you lack wisdom, you should ask from God. Now, when you read that, you could interpret it as, if you lack wisdom, you should ask for wisdom from God. But you could also construct that sentence as, when you lack wisdom, you could ask for endurance from God. Or you could ask for trials and tests from God. It could refer to anything that comes beforehand. And I think James here might be being intentionally a little vague. If you want endurance, or if you want wisdom, guess what? It comes with endurance and it comes with testing and trial. If you want one, you're going to get all three. I think James intentionally links those together by just being a little bit vague in how he writes that. And I think that's a pretty clever little things that James did. So that's awesome. So let's explore that. How do we get endurance? Now that we've looked at just some of the benefits, and we still haven't even reached joy, but how do we get endurance? Can we buy it online? We can buy everything else online. Can't buy it online, can we? You can't go down to a chemist and buy an endurance potion. You can't just read a book or talk to your friends or go to university. If you could, there would be long lines at every chemist. eBay would finally find something it sold out of. But if you look at what James says beforehand, he says that, well, that's where tests and trials come in. You know, all of us have been around long enough. I don't really need to belabor the point. We know that endurance only comes from those that actually get in a fight, that actually have something that they have to stick at day after day, whether it's keeping a business up and running or staying in a job or a literal fight, or managing your finances. You build endurance by consistently pushing against that thing which would hold you back, by consistently overcoming and having to fight for that. And when you look at spiritual endurance, that comes from when God calls you down a path and you follow. And God never promised to be easy. In fact, he promised pretty much the opposite. And you look at what Jesus did to the disciples. He was constantly giving them trials and problems and issues that they couldn't solve on their own. And they would have to learn to trust him, and they would have to learn to walk with him. And it would build their endurance and their faith in him again and again and again. Hey, disciples, go to all of the surrounding villages and tell them about me. Oh, by the way, yes, it is Israel, and they're completely monotheistic, and they're going to struggle a bit not thinking that their Messiah has actually come. But you go off and do that, and then come back and tell me how you went. Here's 5 loaves and 2 fish. Go feed 5,000 people. Hey, I'm going to go water skiing without a boat. Come join me. And only one person did. But Jesus was constantly giving them problems. But then he was giving them the equipping and the tools to actually do that. And they would grow. My favorite one is when the storm comes up and then Jesus quietens the storm after they all panic. Why didn't Jesus just keep it calm the whole time? He had the power to do that. Why did that storm even hit the boat? Well, because if there hadn't have been a storm, then the disciples wouldn't have grown in their faith just yet that one more time. They wouldn't have seen his power and his ability to actually conquer just one more time. Jesus was constantly showing, you need to put your trust and faith in me. And your endurance and your spiritual endurance will grow. There is another song that I thought of, actually, as I was practicing this morning. It's the song Oceans that we sometimes sing here. And the coda to that, it captures this perfectly. It says, Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of you, my Saviour. The author of that, it's a cry from the heart for just this. God, take me into one more trial with you. Take me into one more uncomfortable situation with you, because I know that my faith in you will continue to grow. I will get drawn closer to you. I will get more resolute and more enduring of spirit with you. And as you learn what it is like to go through trials with God, you move in so many weird ways. When we build endurance apart from God, and that's not a bad thing. We all need to actually build a certain level of endurance and resilience in our life. But sometimes building endurance apart from God can turn you cold or hard. Sometimes you can shut off from the world and go, you know what, I'm not going to let that hurt me anymore. I'm just going to push through without emotions. But when you build spiritual endurance, when you walk with God, he starts to do something else rather amazing. You can move from having sympathy to having empathy because you've been there. You've been in the trials with God. You've seen how he responded. You know that God is faithful. You move from needing to have answers to being able to look at a relationship with God and know that, you know what, that's enough. Instead of trying to answer everything and come up with an answer for every single person, you can honestly go, you know what, I don't know what God's doing at the moment. But I'm sorry. But why don't you and me and him, why don't we just walk through this together? Why don't we use this just to build our relationship with each other and with him? And it'll be okay one day. People who can respond like that are gold. But you don't get like that with a very easy life. You don't get like that if you've never faced a trial or a struggle. How many ministries and missions are birthed out of people's own struggles or where they've been wounded deeply, and they know what it is like to walk with God recovering from that. That is the power of spiritual endurance. They're the ones who at the right time come along and they just say, you know what, I have no idea, and I've been there, but with you and me and God, that's going to be enough, and we'll share this pain together. That is what the world so desperately needs. You know, we have a world that's tearing itself apart. And we need Christ followers who can step into that void and actually bring God into that, bring a relationship with God into those situations. So when we see trials, when troubles come our way, we can instinctively say, oh, not again. I don't have the resources to go through this yet again. And it's okay to be real about that. You know, we worship a God who wants us to be real. But we need to then turn around and say, okay, God, looks like you've signed me up for another round of endurance building. Okay, God, looks like you've signed me up for another round of character development. Okay, God, I'm going to come out of this trusting you even more. And then I think that is how we get to this idea where James starts of joy. You know, you look at the characters in the Bible who went through the most. You look at Job. He went through perhaps the most suffering of any person in the Bible. But he came out of that the most humorous and generous and compassionate person you find in the Old Testament. You know, named his kids after makeup and gave the females an inheritance as well, which was unheard of in those days. He was the most generous person because he had been through the most, but he'd been through it with God. You look at Elijah and Elisha, there was assassination attempts on them and they were constantly running from the prophets. But then when they had a chance to destroy the enemy army, no, give them a barbecue. Send them on their way. They met them with grace and it changed the direction of a nation. And you look at Paul. Paul was constantly in prison, out of prison, in prison, shipwrecked, in prison. And yet he kept working the legal system just to share the gospel one more time in one more level of Roman society. They knew that it was worth working with God. That was enough. And they would celebrate what God brought out of the situation, even though they might have been grieving the situation they were in. And I was trying to think of a modern day example that could help us understand, this difference between happiness and joy. And there's nothing wrong with happiness. We should all aim to be happy if we can. But there's something deeper there. And it's like, what's the difference, happiness and joy? And the word joy actually comes from the same base word of rejoice. They share the same common. And I was thinking, what if one of us has a friend that gets a great job opportunity but has to move overseas to follow it? And we go, and what do? We go to dinner with them or we go to a party with them and we celebrate and we rejoice because we know the impact that this is going to have on them and their family and the society they're going. and we rejoice. And it's okay to grieve and be sad at the same time for a friend that we're not going to be seeing for a while. But we rejoice with them because we know the bigger picture. And I think that's a good opportunity. If you struggle to see how joy fits in with trials and testings, perhaps that's a good picture, to take away from this message. We know that God wins in the end. We know that God has met us with grace. We know that God has called us to be a part of that and to actually work with him in changing this world. And we know what the final picture will be. And even if we have to actually grieve or be sad or be wounded at the immediate effects, we can rejoice by seeing what God is building in us. Although there may be short-term pain, we will continue to grow with God, and that is a reason for constant joy. And I think this is where I'll finish. But I think that this will impact the world more than we could possibly know. Because you know what? I cheated when I put James 1:2-5 up there. A lot of people start and just read James 1:2-5 because, that's the bit that speaks about endurance and trials. But there was something right at the start. James 1:1 is the introduction. It's James, a bondservant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, or some translations are scattered. We can too often forget that James was writing to a church not gathered, not at peace, not comfortable. He was writing to the churches that had been scattered by the Roman persecution. He was writing to the 12 tribes that had been dispersed abroad because the Romans were trying to squash this new faith called Christendom. There is a reminder there that he knows they're under persecution. He knows about trials and tests and endurance. He knows they're going through it, and this is a word of encouragement to them. And then if you read the rest of the book of James, he continues to exhort them to be completely countercultural, calling them to action. The verses that speak of showing your faith with deeds, they're in James. The verses of not being partial to one sect over another, they're in James. A modern idea would be, you're at peace and you're non-denominational and you're Lutheran. No, we can't stick together. No. Shouldn't be any division inside the church like that. Those words are in James. The last words of James are about turning others from their sins back to God. It's an incredibly evangelical book. And it starts with, you're under trial, you need to build endurance so you can be complete to do the work that God has called you to do. James effectively preaches the very opposite of prosperity doctrine. And he says, no, you are going to grow the most when you are under the most trial. And that is where you are. And he starts at James 1:1. You're scattered. You've been pushed out of Rome. But God has you exactly where he wants you to. And that is what the world desperately needs. It needs Christians that have actually been pushed out and have endured, but then can actually sit and grieve or weep, but build those connections with those who don't know God yet, and then build that relationship back with him from them. Now, I started today by, referring to Hebrews, chapter 11, and that was this ancient listing or the roll call of faith where we pointed out and said, it worked for this person and this person and this person and this person, and they all endured. And I thought we would end this service with what would actually be a modern version of that. It is a hymn. It's a hymn called Great is Thy Faithfulness. When I was young, this song's been around a long time, but when I was young, it was being sung in church, and I didn't get it. It bored me. I just wanted to get out and go to Sunday school. But this song, you could say it bored me to tears, because I didn't know about endurance. I didn't know about God's faithfulness. But why is this a classic song? Why is this a classic hymn? Because it does tell all of our stories. great is thy faithfulness is sung by one generation after the next, because we can echo the same thing that is told in Hebrews 11. God is faithful, and one generation sings it to the next, and the next, and the next. You know, great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. And so we are going to do that. That is how we're going to close this service today, as we remember the joy that God brings through the trials, through the endurance. But we are going to sing that to each other and to the next generation, that we know that this is a God that builds into us. We know that this is a God who endures and calls us to do likewise. And we look forward to the joy.